What's up guys, RJ Mutton here at the AvidMax studio for a guest edition of Fly Tying Tuesdays. I'm a fly fisherman, fly tyer, photographer, and artist from the Denver area, and I've been fly fishing, tying flies, and drawing trout for over 30 years. Today I'm going to be tying a couple of my favorite summertime Stillwater patterns, so hang out with me for a little bit and check it out. Today we're going to check out a chironomid pattern I came up with called the Armored Chironomid. What I've tried to do here is imitate the natural as closely as I can, both in color and in features. You'll see sort of an armored tail using a silver tinsel, an underbody of micro tubing. You'll see a wing built from razor foam and from thin skin, and then a tuft of gill coming out the front of the hook. What I've noticed with the chironomid is that there's sort of an armor on the tail, and there's an underbody to that. And a lot of the patterns are sort of using a tinsel as a base and a wire going over it. However, it's kind of the opposite of how the natural looks. You'll also see in this pattern that there's sort of a V-shaped wing casing on the underside of the head. And that also really closely imitates the natural. Of course, most of them have this sort of tuft of gill coming out the front of the fly. So let's go ahead and check out how to tie this bad boy. We're going to start with a Tiemco 200R in size 14. Go ahead and place that in your vise. I like to tighten up the rotary so I can control where the hook is. We're going to be using Veevus 14.0 in a rusty brown. This is on a right bobbin. These are great for controlling the pressure at which the thread is coming out the end of the bobbin. I'm going to go ahead and tie it in right behind the eye here with a couple wraps and clip off the excess. For our gill, we're going to be using Sparkle Emerger. This is basically a great wing pattern. Sparkle Emerger yarn in the color cream. I've pulled off a little tuft and sort of split that in half. We don't want too much material coming off the front of the hook, or else it gets harder to put the bead on when we get to that point. So we'll just sort of place it along the top of the shank and get a couple wraps on there to place it exactly where we want it, and then we'll wrap forward towards the eye. Don't want to ever crowd the eye too much when tying flies, so just a couple wraps and then we'll pull it back. At this point we can clip off the excess yarn towards the back. We'll actually be pulling out our whip finisher, going ahead and putting a couple whip finishes behind here. Pull the yarn out of there, sometimes it gets a little tangled. Go ahead and tighten that down. Sometimes what you can do is, if it's getting a little tangled, is you don't have to fully trim it, but you can clip off some of the material to make it a little bit easier for that whip finish. We'll probably throw a second one on here just to make the front of the fly a little bit more durable. So at this point you actually clip off the thread. We're going to go ahead and add a bead. Today we're going to use the Killer Caddis bead in size medium. This is actually a root beer color. It seems to imitate the color of the natural pretty well. Although you can tie this pattern in a couple different colors, you could certainly use a black bead or a white bead on the front of this fly to sort of switch up the color schematic and imitate different types of chironomids depending on what's in your local water. So we slide the bead on like that. And at this point we can go ahead and trim down the gill to size, so really only a couple millimeters off the front of the hook there, just like so. If you look at a picture of the natural, you'll see that the gill is not too long, sort of splays out like that, typically white with a bunch of curly strands, so the Sparkle Emerger yarn imitates that really well. We'll grab our thread again and go ahead and tie in behind the bead. Just get a couple wraps so you can clip off the tag end again. And from here we're going to go ahead and Do a couple more wraps behind the bead to secure it. We don't really want it getting in the way as we start to add different materials towards the back of the fly. Test the bead. Still needs a couple more wraps. That should really solidify the front of the fly. So now that we have our bead secure, we're gonna go ahead and add the next material, which is Mylar Tinsel. This one's actually in a gold and silver. So what you're gonna wanna do is take the gold side, make sure that it's facing you, put it along the side of the shank that's facing you, and start to tie it in. That will pull the material towards the top of the fly. I like to pinch the tinsel with 2 fingers to add a little bit of pressure. This keeps the material close to the shank and make sure that it doesn't bunch, and it allows you to sort of wrap towards the back nice and evenly, keeping the body nice and even. You never want to add too many thread wraps on the underside of the next material. So we're actually going to tie this pretty far back onto the shank of the hook. As you can see, we go a little bit beyond the barb, almost to the center of the bend. And when you look at a natural chironomid, you'll see that they sort of curl a little bit towards the tail downward. We'll go ahead and wrap all the way back up to just behind the bead. The next material we're going to be using is a micro tubing. This one's actually in pheasant tail, which is a really neat color, but you can certainly use blood red or just plain red or any of the browns or even olive if you're looking to tie one in a little bit more of a light green shade. Again, you sort of start the material a little bit closer to you, tie it down onto the top of the shank. And if the material gets away from you a little bit, you can just pull it back onto the shank. Make sure that it's going down the top of the shank. And we're going to wrap backwards to try to keep that underbody nice and even. Same thing with the tinsel, with the micro tubing. I like to grab it with 2 fingers and pull. And you can put a lot of pressure on this micro tubing. So I'm sort of pulling it from 2-3 inches to almost 5-6 inches in length. And what that does is that minimizes the amount of material being tied onto the shank of the hook, and it keeps the underbody, like I said before, nice and even. So we'll go ahead and tie this micro tubing all the way back to the middle of the bend of the shank, and then we're going to go ahead and work our thread forward. Again, always being conscious of how clean that underbody is. That will help a lot once we start to wrap these materials forward. That's sort of what it looks like at this point. The first thing we're going to do is grab this micro tubing and start wrapping it around the shank. So in this case, I don't tend to use the rotary function of the vise. And what I'll do is at first add quite a bit more pressure to the micro tubing and then lighten up that pressure as we move forward. And what that will do is make sure that it tapers from a much thinner underbody to a little bit thicker of an underbody as we move forward. So in those first 3 or 4 wraps, you have quite a bit of tension, and then you start to relieve tension as you move forward. These are touching wraps, so always be conscious that you're not covering the last wrap with your next wrap, and that you're not too far out from your last wrap with your next wrap. You want these to be nice and close together and create that nice segmentation in that underbody that will mimic the natural. This part takes a little bit of time, but we're not in a race here. What I like to say is that fly tying is for fun, so if you're ever doing any part of it that is not enjoyable, then you're probably not doing it right. If you're worried too much about how good your pattern is or how fast you tied it or getting it done right the first time, then you're worried about the wrong things. What you should really be focused on is creating a bug that you're going to have a lot of confidence in when the time comes that you find those feeding trout, You want to make sure that they're eating what's on the end of your line. And so sometimes in order to create confidence, you have to take time. So we'll go ahead and wrap that material all the way till it's almost to the bead. We can go ahead and tie it off. I'd like to put 3-4 wraps in there. Go ahead and stretch the material quite a bit and clip it off close to the body. That will leave no tag end and plenty of real estate behind the bead for when we go to finish the fly in a little bit. Put a couple extra wraps in there to clean it up, and there you can see the segmentation of the micro tubing in the underbody. So it doesn't need to be perfect. We are going to be wrapping this Mylar tinsel forward, and it will cover up a good portion of that micro tubing, but it's still, you know, pretty clean so that the parts that poke through have a nice even segmentation like the naturals. Okay, so now we're going to actually engage the rotary function of the vise. So I'm going to loosen up the screw on the side here that holds it tight. And we're going to put in an extra maybe 10 wraps onto the hook here, as opposed to whip finishing and pulling in our thread holder. And I find in tying this pattern that works a little bit better. Both are great options when using the rotary function. And we're going to take the tinsel, and the first wrap is going to go back towards you along the bottom part of the hook. And you'll see we'll use that rotary function to make sure that we're laying down this tinsel in very even ribbed wraps. So these are not touching wraps. You want to have maybe 1/2 millimeter of gap between each wrap so that that micro tubing is showing through as an underbody. And take your time on this part. You really want to make sure that the gap looks nice and even between each wrap, and that as it's coming together, you don't have to redo it, and it looks like the naturals. So you'll see if you look at a picture of a natural, there is a pretty good gap between each piece of armor. So I actually want to go ahead and bring these wraps all the way behind the bead of the hook, and then go ahead and tie the tinsel off. So first with a nice light wrap like that to make sure you grab it in the right place, and then after that some nice tight wraps to secure that material. And what we can go ahead and do is clip off the tinsel right behind the bead. Now you could probably fish this fly just like this, you know, without building any more bells and whistles into it, but there are some more things to a natural that we want to go ahead and add here. I'll throw a whip finish in just to make sure that we've secured every step we've gotten to this point. Now we can work on the wing casing. So there's two pieces of material in this wing casing. There's an underside of it, which is actually this AvidMax razor foam in opaque brown. And then I've been using this thin skin bought here at AvidMax, and this packet is the brown, but it has a lot of different patterns in it. So really any of these are going to look good in that underbody. So feel free to experiment when you're tying flies for yourself. What we're going to want to do is cut off a little bit of thin skin and peel the back off so that it's see-through, just like that. And then we're going to clip it at a point. And same thing with the razor foam. I mean, this is about 2 millimeters, 2 to 3 millimeters wide, and then go ahead and cut it to a point. And what you do is you take the thin skin and lay it on top of the razor foam, like so. And that gets so that both points come to the same place. So now we're going to flip the fly upside down. We're going to lay the wing casing along here, and we're going to go ahead and start to tie it in. So the wing casing on the chironomids is not substantial, but definitely want a couple, millimeters of material from where your tie-in point is to the end of the point there. So probably maybe 3 millimeters. And then we'll go ahead and secure this on there with some tighter wraps. Make sure that that thing stays positioned where you want it on the underside of the fly. Now the tricky part is obviously trimming all this material out, so you can sort of start with both, clipping it as close as you can to the bead, and then we'll work on tidying that up a little bit. So always important to have nice sharp scissors. These are the Loon razor scissor, but what I always remind myself and other people of is to replace your scissors frequently, especially the ones you want to use for cutting off materials nice and close. And when you don't want to shred the material and you want it to cut nice and clean, it's really important that you have a good set of scissors. So the underside of this fly doesn't need to be perfect. We're going to go ahead and start wrapping over the material here to create sort of a piece of the segment behind the bead that's this color of this brown thread, this rusty brown. Trying to get coverage over the material as best as we can. And then we can bring the wraps up closer to the bead. Make sure this part of the fly is nice and even. And we can go ahead and whip finish at this point. And just like some of the other gentlemen who have tied in this seat before have said, it's always good to throw in 1, 2, maybe even 3 whip finishes. We are going to be using some UV resin on here, so it's not quite as important as if you weren't going to be using the UV resin. However, you still want to build in durability to your flies wherever you can. If this thing starts going off, I want to keep it on the end of my line for as long as I can and bag as many trout as I can. So now we're going to take this Loon UV resin. This is in thin clear. We're going to apply some to the thread wraps here. And then we can use a bodkin to spread it on here evenly. I like to take the tip of the bodkin, work my way around the thread wraps, making sure that we've got nice even coverage with that UV resin, and then we'll go ahead and hit it with our lamp. So this is a Loon UV flashlight, essentially. They have that from a lot of different brands. Doesn't really matter which one, as long as it throws that UV light off there. One thing I like to remind people is that if you tie a lot of flies, it's important not to look at the fly when you're hitting it with that UV light. You really don't want that UV light flashing back at your eyes, because it can damage the cones and rods inside of your eyes. So it's always good to put your hand up, wear some sunglasses, or look away when you're hitting the fly with that UV light, because over time, if you tie a lot of flies, it will definitely have an impact. So be safe out there. All right, so at this point, we've finished up the fly. Looks nice and durable, kind of like the natural. Go ahead and spin that around a little bit. You can see that wing casing with that razor foam on the underside. So this is an unweighted fly, and I like that. What I do is I fish these a lot off of tag ends, and that razor foam allows this fly to sort of float up. So what I'll do is I'll build a rig with a heavier fly towards the bottom, usually a jigged fly, like a leech or a mop fly, and then usually a couple feet up, maybe 1.5 feet up from that jig fly, I'll tie a tag and have this fly dangling off of it. I actually like to tie 2 of these above the jig fly so that it's hitting different parts of the water column. But this thing will float up on the tag and sort of sit to the side of your tippet, and it, that allows it to sort of waver in the current, and I believe gets you more eats. So that's the Armored Chironomid. Thank you so much for joining us here on Fly Tying Tuesday. Have a great day.